In this episode, we have the privilege of speaking with trauma survivor, healer, and author of Trauma as Medicine, Sarah Salter Kelly. Today, she shares with us many of the incredible insights from her book that helped her and so many others heal from trauma. Join us as we discuss questions such as, how do you trust your gut instincts even when they've let you down in the past? How can we discern whether we're operating from fear or intuition? And how does our individual journey with suffering play a role in the collective awakening of humanity? Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our show. And we are super excited to kick off our new series on trauma recovery from surviving to thriving. And today we kick this whole event off with Sarah Salter Kelly as she shares with us insights from her incredible book called Trauma as Medicine. Now, as we were putting this series together, this series actually started literally about over a year ago. So I was in the process of my wife and I had done a lot of courses over that time period, sort of the prior to a year and a half ago on trauma. So we wanted to really dive into that, both working with any of our own trauma and learn more about it, and just really felt like this was something that a lot of people were going through. A lot of my patients had aspects of trauma that was essential to work with in order to create optimal health and to heal from certain conditions. And so we really wanted to dive into this and understand it better. So Taya and I did a bunch of different workshops on trauma, and we worked with some of the top experts in the world, like Dr. Peter Levine and Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. And so we really dug deep into this. And so last year, I had started actually interviewing. I interviewed some of the top names in the world of psychiatry and healthcare and body-centered medicine. And we had started that series, and then COVID hit and everything kind of got pulled back. I felt like we needed to focus on a whole bunch of other stuff at that point. And so that kind of put on the back burner. And now we feel like this is really the time to bring it back and start to pull it together. And in that time, I've come across so many other people's work that I'm super excited to pull together for this series. And we're still kind of collecting some of the names, but it's going to be a phenomenal series. And I truly believe that we all need to work with our traumas. And trauma doesn't always have to be these huge, big, overt traumas. I think on some level, everybody has experienced trauma, and part of our overall ability to heal and unlock that natural healing capacity involves us clearing out and healing from all of our traumas. So I think that collectively there's a lot of trauma coming up in the world right now. It tends to be what happens. The external world shines a light on what's already on the internal world. And you're going to hear this from a number of different guests, and we're going to share insights from all across. I mean, we're going to talk to like psychiatrists and body-centered therapists. And then I came across Sarah Salter Kelly. So as I was in the process, I was saying to Tay, I'm like, man, I want to talk to someone that really understands sort of more of almost like an indigenous culture of how they deal with trauma, almost like a shamanic practice of how they deal with trauma. And then literally, I think within probably a few days, an email came in from Sarah Salter Kelly's publicist asking if she would be a good fit for a show. And I'm like, yeah, we're actually just putting together a big series on trauma. So they sent their book over and we read it. And I got to tell you, I was in tears several times reading through her book. It is such an eloquent book, the way that it is written, and it is so soulful, and she shares stories. And I feel like even just in the process of telling certain stories, there's healing that occurs just in the sharing of stories. And Sarah will go through her story during the episode, but we get into a lot of different conversations around trauma and even around gut instincts and intuitions. And what do you do even when your gut instincts seem to have let you down? How do you build trust again to actually connect back and listen to it? What does healing actually means? And how does individual healing play into global awakening of humanity? And so some really interesting topics. So enjoy this series. And again, we will be setting up a live event with Sarah as well. So check the YouTube channel, check Facebook, check Instagram. All of those handles are at our website on inspirehealthpodcast.com. You can connect to all of that. All of the lives, and when we pull together different members for these, whenever we do series, we often try to get different guests together and do a roundtable discussion where we answer your questions live. You can write your questions in, you can post them live. So make sure you sign up at Dr. Jason Loken ND on YouTube, because that's where we run all of those events. They're not through just the podcast platform. They're only going to be on YouTube. They're all video. So check that out. And this series is going to be phenomenal. I really feel like we were super drawn to pull this together, and I'm so excited already. I'm buzzing about the guests that we've had and the conversations that we've already had at this point. I think it is going to be incredibly helpful. And all of this information is free. This is like a passion project for TNI. So please get it out, share it with everybody that you think would benefit from hearing this information. Ultimately, it helps us share the message, and it helps more people heal. And I feel like if we're going to make some big collective changes in this world, it starts with each individual. And the more that we can heal our bodies, we can heal ourselves, that ripples out, and that's what creates shifts in the world. So thank you so much for tuning into this series. I think this is an incredibly potent and powerful series that people need to hear. And I have a lot of gratitude for all of the guests that have joined us for this series. So thanks so much, and share it widely. I'd also like to give a shout out to C60 Purple Power for sponsoring this series and giving anybody that wants to try their product 15% off. All you have to do is go to the website at inspirehealthpodcast.com and click the link that's there, or click the link in the show notes, and it will take you to their site. Use the promo code DRLOKEN, all in capitals, that's Dr. Loken, and you will get 15% off your order. It's also very fitting that C60 sponsored this specific series on trauma, because one thing that we know is that a lot of times trauma can actually create inflammation in the brain. So I want to show you an article here. This is an article I was looking at called "Inflammation in the Brain Changes Observed in Complex Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder." So what they're essentially finding here as you go through, they're using a machine called a functional MRI. And this actually literally will look at images on the brain. It can take pictures of the brain, and we can look for changes. One of the guests that we actually talked to is Dr. Ruth Lanius, who's one of the foremost world experts in using functional MRI in trauma. And her episode is really phenomenal too. We'll see where the brain shuts down in different areas that switch around. So in this, they're saying that what this study showed was how vital regions of the brain associated particularly with emotional regulation and memory consolidation are damaged when exposed repeatedly to traumatic stress. So whenever somebody has trauma, especially repetitive trauma, we can actually create damage to the brain. We can create inflammation in the brain. Now, as you will learn from many of the different guests, one of the key parts of healing from trauma is really supporting your overall health. So even proper diet, proper nutrition, movement, proper blood circulation, keeping inflammation down in the brain, making sure that we actually have the biology is all on track and the physiology is all on track, so we can even make the different changes that are required to heal from trauma. So C60 is one of the things that we've looked at in the past, and it actually can help because of brain inflammation with conditions like depression and anxiety. So I think that it's really wonderful to be able to have these different kinds of support, so that when we're working through something like trauma, outside of, and you're going to learn a lot of different skills necessary to heal with trauma, and you might find certain ones that resonate more with you than others. But part of it is also working on the physical body, making sure that your diet is dialed in, making sure that you're eating clean foods, you're detoxifying in many ways, and at the same point that you're keeping inflammation down, so that you can literally heal the physiology in the body, so that you can actually start to reprogram and make new neural networks more effectively. All right, everybody, I hope you enjoy this episode, and as we kick off the trauma series, so buckle up and get ready.
Welcome to the Inspire Health Podcast. Your life is about to get a whole lot better. Have you ever felt like you tried everything and yet still couldn't find the answers or the solutions that you were seeking? Whether you're dealing with chronic illness, physical or emotional pain, I want you to know that your body is the most sophisticated machine on planet Earth. Your body holds unfathomable wisdom. Trust in it and learn from it. Know that there are answers and there are solutions to your specific health challenges, and we will be uncovering all of them here on the Inspire Health podcast. I'm so excited to be a part of your healing journey. Your transformation starts now. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Inspire Health podcast and to our new series called Trauma Recovery from Surviving to Thriving. And today's guest is Sarah Salter-Kelly, and she's going to open this series up for us. And Sarah is a talented writer, healer, and speaker. She utilizes the raw, compounded teachings of her life experience to uplift, empower, and guide others. Her wisdom is authentic, embodied, and hard-won, generated through years of integrating the tragic homicide of her mother and learning to forgive the perpetrator, alongside 30 years of studying personal growth, mysticism, restorative justice, and earth-based healing traditions. Over the past 14 years, she has run a private healing practice, facilitated retreats in Canada and in Peru, taught trauma-focused and shamanic healing workshops, and presented at conferences and public events. She is a mother, wife, and lover of organic gardening, as well as an avid outdoor enthusiast. Her spare time is spent exploring the edges of the wild for solace, connection, and the challenge of physical endurance. Sarah resides in Grand Forks, BC with her family, and we are going to dive into her book today called Trauma as Medicine. Sarah, what a pleasure having you on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to be sharing this with everybody.
Oh, us too. And I am also, if you notice here, I'm also with my wife, Taya Shabazi, and Taya runs most of the work on our sister platform called Adventures in Joy. And so we'll put a link to that too, so you guys can check out some of the information we do there. But Taya, maybe say just a little bit about Adventures in Joy before we get into this.
Adventures in Joy is the experience of what it is that we're sharing. So we host workshops and retreats to facilitate an awakening of what it actually means to live your true potential. And I feel like even as what we've been investigating and uncovering, including, the conversation that we're going to have with Sarah around trauma, like these are all of the works that is really important to do, the shadow work, to actually arrive at what it is to live our true potential. And so the Adventures in Joy platform is simply the platform that we created in order to host those events, in order to facilitate these awakenings.
Mm-hmm. And on the platform, she does a lot of the work where she'll interview different heroes that are sharing their stories and their processes. And even though we talk about Adventures in Joy, I think, and Sarah, you probably get this too, joy is not this sort of lofty state that you kind of sit in all the time. A lot of times, in order to really experience joy, you've got to go through a lot of the other stuff to even arrive. And even then your concept of what joy is, I think, transforms into something very different. And so if you're interested in that, go check it out. But you'll kind of see as we go through this series, some of this type of work that we're going to talk about. These are essentials in order to even open up a space where you can genuinely feel joy. I remember talking to, I can't remember the name of the guest, but basically, it was with the bioenergetics work. It was with Alexander Lowen. So, or Frederick Lowen. So Alexander's son, Frederick Lowen. So he was a founder of bioenergetics, and he basically talked about, experience both ends of it, of the sort of heaviness and the dark and the light really depends on your ability and your willingness to go to both ends of that. And so you can only go as far into the happy feelings and the joyous ones and all these things as much as you're willing to kind of go into the other side of it. I think as Sarah talks about, we'll talk about that, but I think you described that as the underworld in a lot of ways. So
yeah, definitely, Jason. And it also makes me think about just some experiences of pure joy that I've had in the last year and a half, and they've actually come through mountain biking.
Yeah.
Through going through this challenge of trying something that I have never really done, and going into the unknown and going out on trails and not sure if I even knew how to make my body work the right way to do it. And then the exhilaration and passion and joy of going through that and realizing how simple it was, facing the challenge, and that this joy is free. And it's right here when we have that willingness to go through whatever the challenge is. So
yeah, I love it. I think of joy as this sort of ever present, ever available experience that's with us all the time. Is just whether or not we're able to connect back to it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful.
Sarah, I want to read the introduction of your book, because when I read this, as I was reading it to Taya, it would get me welled up, because I feel like it is actually so timely and so important at this point in time with what I think humanity is going through collectively, as well as on an individual basis. But I just want to share this because this really resonated with us.
So beautiful.
This is on page 1. Like I was saying to Sarah, I think I had about a page of questions for Sarah, and I'd only got to page 3 of her book. So, once upon a time, long, long ago, so long ago, in fact, that even the oldest of your grandmothers and grandfathers, grandmothers and grandfathers cannot remember, there existed a time and a community that honored and celebrated our deepest wounds as the passage of our soul's evolution. They knew that the initiation to higher learning came from fully embodying the energy of pain until it transformed into something inconceivable, something beyond the scope of the mind and into the wisdom of the soul. This was a process of allowing the poison of what had come to pass to rise up within, to care for this energy with wild dancing, music, crying, wailing, and other embodiment until it emerged as medicine. It seems to me that these folks were in the long ago, but perhaps what I am imagining are the whispers of the ancestors yet to come. The ones who know that what the underworld has to teach us about who we are and who we are becoming is essential. This is a book for those of you who are kin to these ancient future past ancestors, those of you who are tired of ingesting the poison of avoidance, denial, and spiritual bypass, and are ready to delve into the deep, dark territory of medicine making. This is a book for those of you who are hungry for more. Sarah, that's just so beautiful and so poignant, I think. And I mean, as we were reading through your book, there's so many parts where I just like, gosh, she was just so dialed in with how she was expressing herself. And maybe we can start the process by can you share with us a little bit about your story and how you moved from surviving to thriving from trauma?
Absolutely, Jason. Absolutely. First off, it was beautiful hearing somebody else read those words. And so I thank you for starting us off with those. Through the years, when I would be speaking at conferences, I would have an opportunity to get really curious about what was it that I went through or that occurred inside of me that made me trust that I could heal homicide. You know, what kind of mixture of elements, if you will, what ideas or beliefs or ways of being added to my own personal repertoire that led me into the underworld. And so something that landed as I would, unpack all my experiences and explore and ponder what these roots were, I came to see that aside from spending a lot of time outside as a girl, going outside into the forest or the ravines and singing as loud as I could whenever I needed to, or crying if I needed to, and having that sense of connection with the land. That was a really big one. I also left home at a really young age, right before I turned 16. And so I've often joked that I was kicked out the same day that I moved out, and that both of those experiences occurred. And my parents were really strict, and I had this awakening moment that I didn't have to fall under their authority anymore, right? I could choose my own. And so that desire to trust my own authority became one of the precursors to how I managed grief and trauma. And so in the first couple of years that I was on my own, with my kind of forthright, tenacious spirit, feeling like I could, manage or handle whatever came up and do whatever I wanted and prove that I could survive, I ended up in a lot of really precarious situations where my felt sense had to be engaged. Right? I had to be conscious of the energy inside of me and around me to literally make sure I was safe. Right? There was some moments where I was homeless or maybe not sleeping in safe places or didn't have anything to eat. And so in some of those situations, I was given such an inner strength and a capacity, as I said, to trust myself. And so fast forward to, a few years later, when I was 20 years old, my mother was attacked and raped in the parking lot or the parkade of her workplace. And this was December 7th of 1995. It was a miserably cold day, probably minus 38, like one of those, days that are so cold in Alberta that people no longer feel hardcore about their capacity to handle the cold. They, yeah. So it was just this horribly cold winter. And we didn't know what happened to her for 10 days. And so at that age of 20, as I said, I had gone through some tough experiences, but I had also, turned my life around, so to speak, taking some personal growth workshops at about the age of 17 and started working in a music store and became self-sufficient and all of those things. And so that's where I was at when my mom went missing. And I had this sense at that time period that for whatever reason, my mother and myself included, my family included, would be immune to the I'm trying to think of the word that I want to use, to a random act of violence, because we were on these conscious spiritual paths, right? So I had this, naivety perhaps to think that. And so in many ways, my mom was also one of my first spiritual teachers. She was a life coach. And, I had gone to spiritual healing workshops with her. So there was this sense that because in my assumption, I was doing, the work of the universe and she was, and we trusted our instincts and listened to our bodies. And so therefore you should be safe from those, from being attacked by a stranger in the parkade of your work. And evidently it doesn't work that way. And so over those 10 days that my mom went missing, my family obviously grappled with, being with the shock and of not knowing what happened and imagining the worst case. And then also having to kind of play detective or Nancy Drew to help out the investigating detectives to the best of our ability. And you just kind of go into autopilot to get through each day or each moment. And so that's what I did. And that's what my extended family did. And a few days after she went missing, an aunt of mine remembered that my mom had a one-of-a-kind gold ring. And we had the jeweler remake this gold ring. And it was the gold ring itself that led us to recognize the person who had bought it off of the alleged perpetrator, contacted the police. And so that's how we found out who the alleged perpetrator was. And so about 10, 11 days after she went missing, her body was found in an abandoned farmhouse about an hour outside of Edmonton. And that was also around the time that this alleged perpetrator turned himself in. And so in some ways, we're happy to know what happened because there's so much anxiety when you have a murdered or a missing, at that time we didn't know murdered, a missing family member. Just so much anxiety over not knowing what happened. It's really hard for the human psyche to be with that. And yet at the same time, now we were confronted and face to face with what happened. And so again, you just go into autopilot. I think that our nervous system shuts down and just manages what is essential. There's a lot in the first year after she died that I don't completely remember. Pieces will come back here and there. And so there was a preliminary hearing about 6 months later, and then a trial in March, April of 1997 that was about 6 weeks long in total. And that's one of the other really difficult things with a homicide case, is that you have to go through these really impersonal experiences with court. And I've had clients more recently. I've taught a trauma as medicine weekend retreat for quite a few years. Although I haven't at present for a couple of years. It was on hold while I was writing my book. And I had a client about 2 or 3 years ago who had lost a family member to homicide more recently. And the amount of social media and like the public onslaught sounded like it was thousands of times more difficult than what myself and my family went through in the 90s. So just imagining how difficult that is, and people making comments about your family member, like all of this stuff. I found it really hard with just the newspapers, and so that's part of the process. And unfortunately, in our justice system, we the intention behind it isn't the reparation of harm done. And so when you go through an experience where you are so deeply wounded, there's this desire, I think, inside of all of us humans for that to be acknowledged or validated in some way that can add to our healing. And yet that doesn't happen through the criminal justice system. And the unfortunate part is quite often whoever goes into the criminal justice system comes out worse than before. And so what we knew about this perpetrator, Peter Bright Eyes, is that he was First Nations and had been in and out of the system since he was really young. So I remember looking at him in the courtroom and really having the sense that he wasn't there. He wasn't in his body. And trying to figure out how this process of court was going to make my mom's homicide any better. Like how does this work? That's what I was thinking, right? And then also knowing, because he was a violent offender, that it was better than him being out on the street. He had only been out of prison for less than a week when he attacked my mom. And so there was just so much to be with that felt, horribly painful and devastating, and that also showed the dysfunction of the systems that govern us. And so in the few years after she died, a lot of my time would be spent outside on the land, like when I was a little girl, walking through the ravines, singing and crying, and moving that energy. And I didn't necessarily name it as I'm moving this energy. However, I had become a part of the pagan community when I was about 17 years old. And so, and I did my own regular full moon rituals, sometimes outside. And I really trusted in my ability to listen to the land and listen to how I was being guided. And so that definitely drove me outside. And I even though I knew there'd often be people, it was a public ravine, right? I wasn't really in the wild. I was in the center of the city. People who might have been looking down from the higher paths, wondering, like, look at that little hippie woman walking in the water, singing Amazing Grace really loud and crying and wailing. And I just didn't care. It was like, I didn't know what to do with the energy. And I think that is one of the most difficult things with grief, is that we have this powerful, intense experience happening inside of us. It's embodied. And culturally, we don't have containers that help us to move that or feel it or experience it. So I often felt like I was having to make my own up. And though I could have conversations about it with family members, everybody experiences grief differently. And And it didn't seem to be as important to some of my relatives to be walking through the ravine barefoot, screaming and singing. And, like anytime I felt that heavy energy, I wanted to go into it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that brings me even to another point, because there's nothing I hate more than feeling bound.
Mm-hmm.
I hate that feeling of being bound, of not being free. And so I think it's easy for us to identify our trauma on an internal level as it represents anywhere that we're bound, anywhere where we feel constricted or stuck or tied. And that was how I taught myself to recognize what it was that was binding me, and then figure out how to be with it, how to move it. And so that subsequently led to what I describe in more detail in my book, but creating situations as I recognized what I was afraid of to release that fear. And because my mother was such a prominent spiritual influence in my life, is that I could hear her talking in my ear all the time in those first few years. And and I would argue with her because she'd be saying stuff like, well, Sarah, there's no accidents. And Sarah, everything happens for a reason. And I would say, well, Mom, I used to believe you, but you got murdered. So your credibility is kind of, not so great right now. And, and yet through the years, as I sank into what she was saying, my attitude changed, and I went, okay, show me. Okay, what do you mean? Maybe that's possible. I'm listening. And that led me to, I might be branching off into another part of the story, but that led me to contemplating, why are we even here to begin with, right? Like, what is the greater scale picture of being human, and the spiritual aspect of ourselves that comes here? And could it be, if there's no accidents, or if everything happens for a reason, could it be that what's unfolding right in front of us is exactly what we came here to learn? And if that's true, even though some of it's really painful and really difficult and really hard, could that still be the exact ingredients that help us to come into a place of transformation?
Mm-hmm.
So those were some of the pieces that I was sitting with in those first 10 years, and contemplating. And I mean, I also married my my husband now, we've been together 27 years, and I became a mom. And a lot of the act of becoming a mom opened me even deeper into my heart center, because it's such a vulnerable position to be in. Mm-hmm. and to recognize ways that I may or may not be projecting unresolved fear onto my daughters. I was such a, I was in the punk movement, if you can call it that, when I was 16, 17. And so much of my, punk rock attitude was that, I would walk at night if I wanted to, and I would challenge anything that I felt was oppressive. And as women, and as a woman, I was just as powerful and just as equal as anybody else. And so with twin daughters, wanting them to have a sense of personal power, and also recognizing their vulnerability, and also recognizing my vulnerability as a mother. And so, and we can touch on some of that as our conversation unfolds too, to recount the rest of the piece with Mom's death. It was about, and I ramble, so if I'm rambling for too long, you let me know. It was about the 10-year mark. I had done so much grief work, and a lot of this, I mean, I read books, but I couldn't find anything that spoke to violent loss. And I didn't have internet until maybe 2006. So I know it's hard for some people to imagine, like, so the way to explore was either feeling it myself or what I could find at the library. But there's nothing that spoke of, how do you be with homicide? How do you be with murder? And I had to trust myself in that, because all that I could come up against was, literature that would say things like, well, you're kind of stuck with that. It's kind of, and I thought, no, I got this. I'm going to find a way to move through this energy. And so in those 10 years, I was afraid of walking alone in the dark. And so I made myself walk alone in the dark in a somewhat controlled experience. I was afraid of going into the parkade, and I made myself go into the parkade. And so whatever type of scenario that I recognized caused a trigger for me, I found a way that I could manifest something that was still a little bit scary, but relatively safe. And so that I could learn how to neutralize my own nervous system's response, which was to go into, oh my God, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, and more breathe through it and change my perspective on it. At that 10-year mark, with all of the grieving that I had done, I felt like I was in a place where I was more complete with mom dying. I even had an experience that I describe in the book as murder on the wind. And I was facing the east direction out of my driveway. We lived in a little city called St. Albert at the time, outside of Edmonton. And I felt like this vast wind came upon me. And in that moment, I could feel my mom's spirit come inside of me, beside me, around me. And I saw all of the last minute details of her death. And then I felt this sensation of profound grace, like profound, there aren't really words to describe it, just absolute connection to source. And I knew she was showing me that she was okay. And for whatever reason, I needed that confirmation, right? I needed to know that. And so at that moment, or in the preceding few days, I realized for the first time in 10 years, the only energy left inside of me that really needed to be addressed was towards her perpetrator. And I had never addressed him, in part because he had hung himself in jail after he was found guilty of Man 1. And I knew from what I'd heard through the media that he had had a difficult life. And so there was a big part of me that thought, what was the point? However, that part of me that thought, what was the point, was shutting down the feelings of rage that were very real inside of me. And so the part of me that was saying, what's the point, likely is also connected to the pleaser part of me that wants to be nice or wants to be good or to say or do the right thing. And once I saw through that and recognized that this rage was really inside of me, and also that I could feel him around me more and more frequently at that point. I'd see him in my mind's eye, and I would do anything that I could to try and push his head out of my mind, and nothing that I was doing was working, and it was requiring a lot of energy just to push him away. And often his image would come into my mind at really intimate moments where you don't want the perpetrator of your mother's homicide in your head, such as when I'd be about to make love with my husband, or if I'd be nursing my babies, like some of those moments where your heart is so out there. And then it was kind of like his head would come into my mind going, nah, 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 nah. Think about this really horrible thing right now. And so it occurred to me that maybe instead of spending all of this energy pushing him away, that I needed to draw him in. Like maybe I needed to do something different. And coming from a really sustainable mindset, my values or viewpoint on life, whether it's from an environmental or a personal growth perspective, is really conscious that we can't get rid of the things we don't like. Like we're not gonna, there's no place for our plastic or the toxins that we create to go. We're gonna have to figure out how to transform them. There's no way. I think I watched a great speech by David Suzuki before talking about how we used to launch garbage into space, thinking that that was the solution. And so, there's no place for, we have to be able to recycle, compost, transform. And so that occurred to me that I needed to be applying that to how I was approaching this perpetrator, and that maybe, even though he wasn't alive, there was a way in which I could have a conversation with him. With so many years of a personal practice in creating my own ceremonies for healing and for just celebration of the land and the equinoxes and the solstices, I felt adept enough to create something where we could have a conversation. And so that preceded the year of 2006. I spent about 9 months doing that. So it was about once a week. And I would allow it to be as organic as possible, whether I wrote letters and burned them, whether I wailed and screamed. My twins were in kindergarten, and my son was about 7 months old, and he napped. So when the girls were at kindergarten and my son was sleeping, I was like, I'm going to make use of this time. I got an hour and a half. and I did. And so, and I think that was such a teaching experience for me, because I didn't necessarily know before that, if you called a spirit, that they would come. I didn't necessarily realize that I had the power to do that. It had occurred to me, but because it was foreign, I didn't know. And so it was so empowering to be able to address him myself and actually speak the truth, and actually let any of that rage come forward, any of the madness or the crazy or the that was going through my body. And then something really strange happened after a couple of months. I had this grandmother that's one of my guides, so a spirit helper, that I call Grandmother Bone Woman. And she's like the crone archetype, the wise woman archetype. And often when I would do these ceremonies, I'd feel her near me. And on this one in particular, I went on a meditation journey. And in this meditation journey, I saw myself sitting on a sand wall. And this wall was in a desert location. And I had a little boy sitting beside me. And I had my arm wrapped around that little boy, very much in the same way you would your own child, where when you're holding them, you can feel that you're actually wrapping your heart around them. And so I was holding this little boy who was probably about 9, 10, 11. And before us was this small pyramid. And I was talking to this little boy about something that he needed to take responsibility for, knowing that it was at this pyramid. And he was a little bit reluctant, and I was encouraging him the way that you would your own child, and really giving him the sense of love and compassion. And then I realized that the person in the journey, first off, that was me, and that the little boy was Peter Bright Eyes. And I pulled myself out of that journey with a big what the fuck, because how could I feel that? How could I feel compassion for a murderer? And then I think immediately after sensing that, it was, what would my family think? What would my family think if they knew I had this feeling of love for this person who caused so much devastation in our lives? And yet the knowing part of myself that witnessed it knew 100% this was real. You just had compassion for this guy, and who he is not different from you. And that was like this big revelation too. My spirit is not better than his. He's not the scum of the earth or whatever are any of the type of judgments or stereotypes that we want to place on somebody who has killed another. And so there was this great battle happening inside of me, probably for a couple of years, as I digested that required a lot of metabolizing, to be with here is this feeling of deep compassion, and yet I'm still really angry at this guy. And that honestly was just a process of sitting with it. I had to just allow myself to be with both, and because that's what was true, right? I couldn't get rid of one or the other. I remember part of me being pissed off, thinking, God damn it, compassion is hijacking my ceremony. I want to be angry. You know, like my plan wasn't to be compassionate right now. You know, that was not on my list. F compassion. And so, you know, it was just a real big process of digesting. And
Wow.
yeah.
You know, Sarah, and I mean, there's so many things there. I've got like, again, like a page of questions on that.
Mine too.
But I think a couple things I want to say that I think is really important. It's like, even when you were talking about coming to compassion, this is, I think, a really important part, because it's like, when we go through, even if it's not like intense trauma, but we still won't even find forgiveness for somebody or something along those lines. And we're taught we want to get to a place of compassion. That's sort of that's the goal, or that's the right thing to do. But I think what your experience shows is that you can arrive at it, but you arrive at it from an organic place by going through the process. And a lot of times people want to go from here to here. And then they think they're doing something wrong because they can't feel this. But I think what you outlined is that the process is where you naturally come to that. You know, it's like, in my experience, it's like when I've had genuine forgiveness that has surfaced, even when I've tried to forgive in the past, it's happened when I've done like a meditation process, or it could be different ways that you can arrive at it, but you almost need to come to a different context. The situation has to change context so you can genuinely see it from a different perspective. So if you've only been seeing it here all the time, you're never going to feel something different. The context of the situation, the perspective has to change so that now I see it from this angle that I'd never seen it before. And all of a sudden, I'm actually filled with an authentic feeling because I can see it from a different perspective. And then from that feeling, I feel like that's where the transformation, the alchemy starts to take place.
Yeah, that's really beautiful.
And that's what I feel like you kind of went through. So then you organically, it's like, oh, compassion's hijacking, but it's almost like you arrived at a natural state because of your ability to go into a different context than how you'd been seeing it from before.
And I think also what's really important, like you mentioned, which just because of this and your process that you had gone through proves just how courageous you are, and it's really admirable. But you had said that every time I felt that heavy energy, I wanted to go into it. So typically our natural inclination as humans is, if there's a heaviness or hard edges, we actually want to stay away from there. We don't want to go into it because we feel vulnerable, or we feel that there's too much risk, or we feel we can't sit with it or be with it.
There's just too scary.
Right, out of fear. But I think that's really pivotal. And even with you wanting to stay with the felt sensation, that's so important, we found. And my background was in psychology, and I got into psychology like from the age of 13. When I knew such a field existed, I wanted to go into it because I felt like I want to know about consciousness. I want to know about the psyche. I want to know how we can create our reality in a more conscious way. And I knew that my life up to that point, even, and the challenges that I had faced, had to be for something greater than what I could understand even at that time. But when I did get into psychology, I was so utterly disappointed because, and I didn't quite understand why, but later on, when I got into yoga and meditation and movement and dance, I realized that a big part of what Western psychology is missing, and even with some of the guests that we've spoken to that focus on Western psychology and that perspective and healing trauma, is that they're missing the part that actually sees and honors spirit, and also embodying that within the physicality of our being. And what you described, again, going into the felt sense, is such an important thing, because you actually use your own body's wisdom and being able to show up for it and meet it, and to be informed and move forward from that place of innate wisdom. And I think that's really beautiful. That's really, really beautiful. And even when you didn't have the outside authority, you know, and as far as the internet and the overwhelm of information often that we can get bombarded with these days, you were able to go back to nature and feel it from a very embodied place, which I think is a big missing piece in Western psychology. We can talk, you know, about it and talk therapy and not even touch it.
Yeah. And even thinking about what you're saying about dance, about movement, I think that that's such a crucial part, because the word embodied means being in our bodies and being able to take different energetic experiences into our bodies and process them. So if you think of that feeling, if you're part of an ecstatic dance experience or a 5 rhythms dance experience, one where you're able to let go completely of the mind, the psyche, and just allow yourself to be danced. When we can allow ourselves to be danced, it's a completely different experience. And so if we can allow ourselves to be the sensation of what's coming through us in trauma in a healthy and safe environment, that's a game changer. And so I think that that's a big part of it, is how do we give ourselves permission to go into the energy, knowing it might be crazy, it might be awkward, it might be wild, you might be making crazy sounds, you know, and to open to that, knowing that it's the wild that is demanding expression, because loss is wild. I just thinking also about what you were saying regarding going into what's heavy. I think for myself, I recognized I had more control if I went into it, not the opposite. It's like, if you don't go into it, it's kind of like that monster that you might be afraid of is, I think I reference it as my book, is under the bed or in the closet. There's always something that you have to be afraid of. Whereas if you go into it, there isn't any unexpected or unknown creeping up on you, right? You're able to experience what is actually there and be with it.
Yeah. And I think I know in somatic experiencing, in Peter Levine's work, he talks a lot about going in and feeling sensation, and then within your own authority, sort of moving back out when it feels like it's too much, like kind of recognizing that you're the controls within you on how far you want to go, and you can come back out and you can come in. So I think part of it is even the retrusting the process that you are in charge. You know, I love it when I see overlaps on things in different systems, because I always think those are fundamental truths around stuff. And I'm an osteopath as well. And in osteopathy, you work with the body. And one of the main ways that we work with the body too is you actually literally go into the lesion. So for example, if say there's a scar, or viscera could be in a certain position, say it's flexed forward and rotated to the right. Well, in order to correct that, rather than trying to just move it into the opposite direction, you actually have to slowly go into the lesion to a place where the body starts to settle right down. It actually goes into a natural healing process where it reorganizes, then it naturally and organically actually then reshifts and comes back out into the position of correction. And a lot of times in the process of even doing that, there is often even like emotional release that sometimes happen with the person. But to me, it's no different. I've even contemplated before, I've talked to Taya about this idea of almost emotional unwinding, where you connect with the body. And again, I might connect with the feeling at the same time, feel in my body where I'm feeling that sensation, allow myself to kind of move into whatever the position is, and then just let my body start to kind of unravel as I stay with the sensation. And it really does have this innate wisdom of knowing how to move you through it, if you stay, when you're able to kind of stay.
It's the staying with it too, right? That I think can be the hardest for any of us. And again, because it's uncomfortable and it hurts,
Mhm.
right? And I think that because whatever caused the pain to begin with obviously created trauma. So then our nervous systems are like, why the hell would I do that? Right. And we're hardwired to jump out of there. So it's kind of retraining ourselves, don't you think, to, you know, and so simulating an environment that's safe enough to trust that we can go back in, but we can state whatever dynamic is necessary for that safety to unfold for us.
Mm-hmm.
I remember even in psychology, it's one of the ways to work with phobias is to literally within a place and feeling of safety and a calm nervous system, you actually create that same scenario or connection or interaction with that thing that that you're intensely afraid of. And then little by little, can you maintain a calm nervous system as you reintroduce that back into your field or your surroundings. And it's even your title, the title of your book, Trauma as Medicine, and what Jason was describing, and as far as even releasing something that's bound or stuck or hurt, you actually have to lean into it in order to come out of it. It's like the only way out is through. It's we actually have to experience it.
Yeah. And you know, it's funny, like we have a lot of rules in our more conventional approaches to that about what is or is not safe to do. And I came up against that myself, just in knowing that I wanted to create this ceremony or have a conversation with Bright Eyes, recognizing he was around me. And initially I did go to see a therapist or a psychologist, recognizing that, you know, I have this sense that I can often do things myself, and that there are people who might be experts or have more skill than I. And so, you know, to invest in that. And I think I just happened to pick one that wasn't a fit for me. And in as much it inspired me to create my own ceremony. But when I spoke to this woman in 2 different sessions about feeling him around me, right away, she tried to create an experience for me where I could get rid of him. Like right away, it was, you know, why don't you imagine a pink light around him and see him disappearing? And I remember thinking, why would I do that? That doesn't feel like a good idea. You know, after 10 years, you know, something's changed and that I feel him closer to me. This has got to be happening for a reason. And then she suggested imagining him floating away in an air balloon. And so that was, you know, I think the initiator of me deciding to address it myself. And so, but even friends that I had who were skilled in, who were part of the women's movement, who were part of the pagan community, anybody I talked to, because I spoke to about 3 people before I had started this ceremony, all said, oh, I don't think that's a good idea. He was a really bad guy. You don't want to talk to him. He was why would you do that? It's probably not safe. You probably need a professional. And so all of those kinds of things, we have all these ideas that we can't heal ourselves, that we don't have what we need within ourselves to face whatever's shown up. And if we instead have the approach that whatever has shown up in our lives has become because it's exactly what we as individuals need to learn from, then somehow we must have the resources inside of ourselves to address it. Like if you think about the old, you know, saying in herbal medicine, the recognition that the poison always exists with it, or the cure exists within a few feet of the poison. And so the same is true within ourselves. Like we must have what it is that we need to be resilient if we're to consider ourselves as a resource instead of somebody that is subject to the, you know, the victimization that life throws at us.
Yeah, such
That's so
a
profound. Mhm.
big important piece, because I'm
Mm.
yeah, so many pieces on that. So because around this trust for, I mean, even before, when you were talking about um, getting rid of it, right?
Mhm.
I mean, that's a very conventional approach. I mean, that's really conventional medicine's approach to things anyways. It's
And
like
that's influenced the spiritual
all of it.
circles, communities as well.
So it's like, well, we know these are good and these are bad. And so there's very little crossover. And I mean, this is the whole concept of why we have things that kill things off. And I
Mhm.
understand that. I understand the point around that. But from a larger philosophical perspective, there's a lot of other ways to view that. And not everything that's there, whether it's a bacteria or a virus, I mean, there's a whole symbiosis that takes place in the body in many different ways. And it's not so clear cut as we need to kill this is bad. I think ultimately there's a lot of processes and thinking that need to be expanded to look at that from a larger holistic perspective. But
And even in the spiritual community, like we've heard so many times and so often, especially this past year, here is a process or a meditation to cut cords or to cut ties.
yeah,
What you're speaking of is a whole different level of understanding. Like it's an knowing from deep within, from having gone through these horrendous experiences, and being able to figure out in your own way what holds true for you. And that's really profound, because even a light Lemurian shaman by the name of Huna Flash, when you speak, you actually speak in a very similar way to the messages that he conveys as well. He said, but you're not different from that. We're all connected. There is no separation. So there's no cutting ties. When you're cutting ties, you're actually severing the connectedness that you have with everything that there is. And I think what you're describing is so profound and so important for us to recognize, because even, when we have troublesome interactions or relationships with our family, for example, we oftentimes think, okay, now I've come to a place where, due to my need to create boundaries, and not that I'm discounting boundaries, that's really important, but I'm going to sever ties. I'm going to say no to that completely. But I know for me personally, it has always felt like I'm actually stepping out. I'm actually bypassing what I know needs healing, what I know needs deeper understanding, and overall knowing that there is a connection, that there is a reason as to why we're here on a spiritual level. One more thing, at the beginning of this COVID pandemic last year, I remember the first initial feeling that came up for me was needing to look around and know the deeper spiritual context of what it is that we're going through. And I didn't even know what that meant at the time. But through further investigation, I recognized that even my definition of spirituality was no longer suffice, was no longer making sense. So even as you were just describing your experiences, what came clear to me is that the definition of spirituality for me now is knowing that every piece of our puzzle of life is sacred. Like, that's it. And even your story and how you were describing it, as you saw that very clearly, and honoring the process that you needed to ultimately go through to see all the dark corner, to go into the dark crevices, to investigate it all, to be with it all, to go back and to meet Bright Eyes as a child who was experienced trauma himself, and to meet him with a lot of compassion. So thank you for that. Thank you for that clarity.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'm really liking that word that you're using, the inner standing. I haven't heard anybody use that before. So I'm going to make note of that, but I really, really like that word, and how it feels or how it lands when you say that word. I think, in reflecting on that place of having the courage to go inwards. And then when we reflect on when we go inwards and we find the experience of shared humanity in whatever way it arises for each of us, we come to a natural recognition that, yes, we can't cut cords. When we say the word, if you think of most Indigenous traditions have some way of saying all my relations. Some way of recognizing that interconnectedness, and that interconnectedness, it's really like a mycelium network that's holding all of us and everything. And so we can't cut off what we don't like. We can't get rid of the family members that, trigger us. We can set boundaries. However, I feel similar to you, Taya, in that it's been important for me to learn how to navigate family relationships, even if they're really uncomfortable. And so there's times where, I make myself do that, and that I would rather show up and be present in the dynamic of the family relationship than cut everything off without facing it. And I think family is one of the best examples for that, because it's really easy to bring other people into our life where we're kind of in control of who they are, and maybe they're like-minded and maybe they're not, but we get to pick. But with family, it gives us such a stomping ground to recognize the truth of who we are and to discern or choose how we're going to be present with that, right? And another piece that's coming to me just in thinking about this subject is that I lived in a very rural community in Alberta for about 13 years, and really great people. And we all had very different views on politics, on spirituality, on how to live. And they were really great people. And we showed up and we volunteered at community events and raised our children, and we're able to learn from each other. However, my neighbors were spraying Roundup on their garden, and that didn't mean I hated my neighbor. It meant it created a great opportunity to say, hey, do you think that's a good idea? Or the other neighbor that came from a very Christian background, who was 100% certain that it probably was against the church to be gay. And it was an opportunity for a conversation, right? And to get curious about what forms our dualistic beliefs. And so that is what shared humanity is. It's not just it's so evident right now. It's not just the anti-vaxxers or I hate using labels, but for lack of a better term, and those believing the common narrative, right? It's like, we're all in this together. And finding compassion for how each person's experiencing what is arising right now is going to help us to be rooted and find a good way to move forward as a society, rather than making the assumption that those with the altering or different point of view from your own are wrong. Mm-hmm. When the pandemic started, I did a journey with COVID, and what I was shown was that I have to let go of everything I know. And that was the biggest, piece of information that I could get from it. This is going to change everything you know, and you have to let go of the ways you do things, everything you believe and see. And like yourselves, I was already 8 months into a midlife change or move, so I had time to be with that. And I still don't have answers about COVID, but
what's funny, Sarah, the feeling that came up months before the official label of the pandemic for me was this intense feeling of death, of imminent death. Like I thought, and I took it on as a personal thing where I thought I was going to die. Like that was the feeling that came up. And I actually didn't convey it to Jay at the time because I didn't know. I didn't know where that feeling was coming from, but I felt like, okay, these are the last few months that I have in this lifetime. But how I'm seeing it now is that I was tapping into the the necessity of letting go of that which we thought we were as we venture into this new stage and new way of being and seeing and perceiving.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wonder if we can talk about the underworld. I really
Yeah,
liked
I
that.
I like the way you described that in the book too. And so you've mentioned the underworld, but can you break down what exactly the underworld is? I know you talk about it as far as regarding the feelings and the conversations and the thoughts and whatnot. Maybe you could explain for people what you mean by the underworld for them so that they've got a clearer idea of what that is, because it also helps them know where where they do eventually need to go.
Right. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and so I think that all of us have some sort of sense of the underworld almost as our birthright through a connection to the to the mythic, from the stories that we might hear when we're little, from the movies that we might see that portray caverns going down into the earth, or entryways into what feels dark and mysterious and unknown. And so I think that often starts off as our understanding of what the underworld can be. And when we're utilizing and creating a relationship with the underworld with intention for our own healing process, it first showed up for me when I started working in the earth-based tradition of the reclaiming community. So in modern day paganism, where we would do led journeys going down into the underworld.
Sarah,
Yes.
one thing I'd like you to do too, because some people don't know exactly what paganism means, and sometimes they associate that with something that is like the devil or something along those
Yeah,
lines. So
yeah.
maybe just for people that aren't
I
aware
can
of it, I
unpack
just want
that.
clarity for you so they get what you mean.
Totally, totally. And so what um there's so many different ways that I can take that. So I'm just listening to what some of my guidance is saying. And so it's my belief that all of us, once upon a time, lived in close relationship with the land.
Mm.
Once upon a time, as humans, somewhere in our ancestry, all of us were in a much closer relationship with the land than we are now. And what happens when we're in close relationship with the land, it starts to teach us in different ways. It starts to inform our understanding and perspective of reality, because we start to recognize that the land is alive, and that not only are we constructing the land in our mind, but maybe the land is also constructing us within its own consciousness. And so when our ancestors, past, present, or future, were in that closer relationship with the land, the organically practices arose that help to honor that. Because organically, we start to think, wow, this is amazing that I have my breath and I have this ability to connect with the spirit of the land through my breath and through the winds that I feel moving through me, or through the fires that are heating my home, that is also similar to the sun that is heating my day and growing my garden, and the earth that I'm planting in, and the waters that are feeding me. And so in an earth-based tradition, which can also be referenced as paganism, there is this deep recognition of the animistic, which means that there's animated spirit in all things, life force that is creative and alive and feeding us at all times. And so often when somebody is, whether they're a part of an earth-based tradition, a pagan practice, or creating their own. And it was, for myself, it was more in my late teens and 20s that I identified it as a pagan practice. And then that name felt too small for me. However, in honoring my roots, it's important to recognize that that's where it grew from. And so in being a part of that, you also start to recognize, or in being connected to the earth, you recognize the cycles of the land, and you start to go, okay, just a second here, everything that grows also dies. What a phenomena. Everything that dies goes into that unknown place in the winter, in the void, until it is dreamed anew in the spring, and it turns into something that once again feeds us. And we recognize the mirror of that, the affinity that we have with that, with our own life, death, rebirth processes inside of ourselves. So we might notice something that we're growing ourselves, a creative project, and then we might notice that we kind of get bored with it at some point, and maybe because we're not watering it, maybe because it needs some sort of energy put into it in order to burst forth. And then when we're complete, it's a reflection of the fall time of the year, where there's the ending, where there's the letting go. And so each of the cycles of the season have some sort of a mirror for the cycles that we go through ourselves. And so in an earth-based tradition, there is a deep awareness that we're not separate from anything, that we belong here. First off, we're not a blight on the surface of the earth, even though we might have blight-like actions. We belong here. And because we belong here, we're being fed by what is here at all times. And I mean, it goes on from there. So there's the reverence for the cycles of the moon. There's the recognition of the sacred feminine and the sacred masculine, and the way that the duality of that infuses how we show up and how we experience what's here.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I just wanted to clarify. In our previous series, there was a lot of talk over the different speakers in different ways around the importance of reconnecting back to nature.
Yeah.
And I mean, personally, I mean, we made a move to be out in nature and more, and we spend a lot of our time connecting to nature. And to us, it sort of feels like the more you do really connect back to nature's principles, there's a profound simplicity that happens in your life too around things. I just feel like we, left up to the human mind, we create a lot more than there needs to be sometimes. And when we do step back out of that and reconnect back to the natural laws of how everything works, there's a certain inherent simplicity, and it naturally changes perspectives on things.
And it out of that naturally sprouts up this importance of feeling, which you've spoken about
an
a lot.
honoring feeling.
Yeah. And I think too, how we allow for setting intention in our life and follow through. I mean, I've had my own garden since I was about 22 years old. And in that practice of growing, I could get really excited in the spring and I plant all of these things. And particularly once I had a family, then I had to, care for and can and process and everything that came out of the garden. And some of the time it wasn't anything that anybody liked, but I would have this really stoic, probably from my homestead ancestors, of you're eating it because we grew it. And I don't care if you don't like zucchini relish. Zucchini relish is, and then looking in my cold room at all of the jars of zucchini relish and all of the time that I spent making it, and learning to bring more intention to what it was I was creating, not doing it just because I grew it or because I should. Instead, maybe even asking the people I was feeding what they wanted. And so just more precision, I noticed, happened through the years with gardening, and a lot clearer focus into my life, and an awareness of how in the other parts of my life I would start projects and not always finish them. And so learning to follow through, learning to be with the watering phases and the harvest phases, and and how simple actually we can make our experience of life when we're rooted in that way, and we're not scrambling through our minds and in the chaos of the unknown that the mind will so often create for us. The principles that show up in gardening definitely simplify everything, which still has to take us back into the underworld, right? So we still got to get down dirty in the underworld. And so some of the ways that the awareness of the underworld can show up is through us having that sensation of needing to go into a dark place that's foreign to us. And often our trauma is this dark place that feels foreign to us. Yes, it happened. Yes, we're storing it in our bodies, but we don't think that we're going to have control over addressing it, because it brought pain and it brought fear, and and likely caused some really big changes in our lives, right? So likely there's going to be a whole bunch of discomfort in going into it. So the underworld can help us to create a safe container because we can map it out. And so that can be an experience for somebody in going on a meditation and just imagining that they're moving downwards into a tunnel into the earth where they find a safe and sacred cave that they feel comfortable in. And so that slowly that relationship begins to be built with the unknown. And then it's from that place that there would be an intentional bringing forward of looking at, okay, well, what possible things could I be storing in the underworld, right? The underworld can be akin to our subconscious. What is unaddressed for me? And this is something that takes time, and then getting curious about how can I bring this into the safe place in the underworld. You might even want to spend a lot of time identifying for yourself what that safety is. Is it the smell of the earth, or does that feel scary for you? Maybe it's stones instead. Maybe there's a water moving through it. Maybe there's some moss growing and you can snuggle into the moss. Like just really bringing that felt sense in, and so that your whole body can sigh into the space and you're safe. That's always the most important part before pulling to you whatever the specific aspect of trauma is that you want to be with for that day. So I describe it this way more in a practice that you can utilize in a meditation experience. However, it also shows up in our day-to-day. There's also moments where maybe somebody will say something and you'll feel triggered and you'll feel this kind of connection in your body into the underworld, where here I am about to address the unknown. Here I am about to feel that yucky, heavy, dark, unknown, uncontrollable, and I won't know what to do. And I feel anxiety. And so when we are able to map it out in a meditation experience, what I'll sometimes reference as a shamanic journey in our day-to-day, in our meditation practice, then when it shows up in our day-to-day, we have some tools to go, oh, okay, right. I know what this is, and I can respond differently to this trigger right now. And when I go home, I can actually go even deeper into what it is that was coming up for me so I can address it.
Beautiful. One thing that will come up lots when people do start to do that process is all of the fears and the sensation of fear that comes up. And I would like you to clarify something for the audience too. So in your book, you talk a lot about connecting to gut instincts and the importance of connecting to gut instincts and intuition. And something that I've heard many times before when I've had conversations like that with different people, and we can kind of unpack this in a few ways, but some people have learned to not trust their gut instincts because they feel like when they trusted their gut instincts, things went horribly wrong, at least in the way that they perceived it. So then it kind of, in some ways, has pulled them away from trusting what the natural body experience is. And then they kind of make a movement to being I'm going to be very intellectual about everything then. And I'm wondering if we can kind of break a few things down, maybe what gut instinct and intuition is, if it is important to connect to it, and how do we even begin that process to start to reconnect to that? Because I feel like in a lot of ways, right from childhood, we start to be conditioned in many ways to not stay with sensation. And when do people know to trust it? Like, when do they know when the fear that's coming up is something that is actually part of their gut instinct telling them to listen to the fear because it's sort of a survival piece? And when is the fear that's coming up actually something that's just getting in the way of true healing to take place? I know that was lots, but we can kind of go into.
We can go back. So to start off with, what is your intuition? What is your gut instinct? It's my belief that your intuition, your gut instinct is how the wisdom of your body informs you. It's how the wisdom of your body directs you or guides you. And that is inclusive of your spirit or your soul And that is inclusive of the guidance of your ancestors or helping spirits. I believe we sense our relationship with them literally in our bellies. And so it poses an interesting analogy when we consider, as you said, so many people are cut off from sensation in that area, where they have learned to numb or negate whatever their instinct is telling them. And so if we consider that when we start to do that, it's often when we're starting to form our own identities, maybe separate from our family groups and along with our peers. Right. So we think of some of the things that we start to learn as we go into school is that we're continuously bombarded with information that says you can't trust yourself, because to trust yourself means that you have to go up against whatever the group think is doing. Mm-hmm. Okay. So when we're trusting our intuition, our instincts, our gut, there's a good chance that whatever the group think is doing is going on a different path. And so that means making a decision to choose yourself over whatever the group path is. And as human beings, we're so hardwired for social connection that it's really difficult for us to make that choice of ourselves over whatever the group think is happening. So I think that what ends up arising for most of us in one form or the other, if we can reflect on our school age years, is that oftentimes the experiences where we chose the group think, we ended up having to betray ourselves. And there was some sort of consequence to that. Whether that was being led into an unhealthy experience, whether that was just the feeling in your own body of self-rejection or the lack of self-love through whatever experience that you allowed yourself to be in. And so the most important way to understand our intuition is going to be through practice. There isn't any kind of psychological or analytical way that I'm aware of anyhow that can say, follow X, Y, and Z, and this is going to give you a healthy intuitive experience. It's definitely through practice and reflecting on the experiences where we did listen and something, and we were led in a good way, and we didn't listen and we weren't. Now, you had mentioned the possibility of people who felt like they did follow their intuition and it didn't lead them right. And this was definitely a question that came up for me because it was my mom who first always said, trust your gut. Like from the time I was probably 8, trust your gut, listen to your gut. And I was pretty sure she trusted her gut. And yet she still went to work the day that she was murdered. And so, part of my own inner reconciliation work was her gut wrong, or was that just her day to die? And it feels to me that just happened to be the time that she was supposed to go. Right. So there can be things that will happen when we're trusting our instinct that might not be what we plan. But the resources that we are actually in control of come from inside of us. So that idea, I think, Jason, needs to be part of what we bring to the table when we're discerning whether or not to listen to our intuition over our head, is that we are going to be more in control if we are choosing to listen to what we have in us rather than ideas or quantifications or analytics that might be coming to us from an outside source. I share a story in my book of a time that I was mugged when I was 16. And it was from not listening to my gut. My gut had told me to turn around. Somebody was following you. You're not safe. And my head had said, oh, well, maybe it's that cute guy that lives in that house over there, and he's going to come and surprise me and put his hands over my eyes. And no, it wasn't that guy. It was, and so when I found myself pushed on the ground and my belongings taken, I realized really clearly that I needed to listen to my instinct. And so that definitely comes with practice. you can simulate practice, right? It doesn't always have to be in a life, threatening situation. We can simulate practice just going about our day and in the choices that we make. So with a meditation practice where you're learning how to sink inwards and listen to your belly and start to form a relationship with your belly. Now that can also bring up a whole other bunch of questions or experiences, because so many of us, women in particular, have severed our connection with our bellies.
Mm-hmm.
We don't like our bellies. We don't want anyone to touch our bellies. We don't touch our bellies unless we're pregnant. So then that gets into that experience too, of how do we change the group think that says one thing about our bodies and make that decision to instead listen to that wisdom, which could also mean, is there wisdom in my body? How do I know there's wisdom in my body? Right? And getting curious about, well, if there was wisdom in my body, if my intuition actually did exist, what would it say right now? How would it lead me? And then applying some of the answers that come up, like bringing a sense of playfulness to it and seeing where it takes you.
Mm-hmm. I love it. It's also like playing. We'll do a lot of what if questions too, because it just opens up the door to allow yourself in a gentle way to experiment with something different, right? That maybe you don't even quite believe yet, but it opens up a door gently to allow you to explore something else.
Yeah.
And when you talked about simulating, I think this is really important. In a lot of ways, the brain doesn't really know the difference between real life experience and what you simulate. So when you do take a practice like that and you start to simulate it, you're building neural networks on how to manage these things. You're building experience that your brain actually thinks is real experience.
Yeah.
So there's we'll often do an exercise that will incorporate like the heart math work too. So you can even go to the drjasonloken.com website, and I have it's called Accessing Your Heart's Wisdom. And it's a meditation that gets you first into a coherent state of heart rate variability, which is generally where the heart and the brain communicate the most. And then from that place, you do open up into deeper sense of intuition. So we'll often do where ask yourself certain questions and see what comes up for you. Then go into that state. And then once in that state and your hands on your heart and you're connecting and the heart and the brain are connecting in a very real way, then ask yourselves the same questions and see if the sensation that comes up in your body is different than what your answer was originally. I find that's a nice way to discern between what my intuition and my gut is telling me versus sometimes what my rational brain is trying to tell me. And again, it's not that the rational brain is bad, but I think it's important to just understand the difference and the sensations that happen in the body when they are different. And then ultimately, how I think I've mentioned before, but it's like then use the intellect and the rational mind as a support from the gut and the heart, right? So from that place, it's a very good, I don't like to use the term servant, but it's a very good tool under that guidance, but it also can lead you very astray when it's not under that guidance.
I agree with you. Yeah, I agree. I like that analogy of going into that place where there's heart resonance first, which is probably why so often I'll combine it with meditation or something where you are feeling rooted and grounded. And then you're asking the question or tuning inwards, because there is so often experiences where fear can hijack whatever it is that the intuition is saying. And I speak to that a little bit in my book and some of the intuition exercises, where we might question whether or not we're being guided in a certain direction. And then we get this, big tensing feeling, no, I'm not supposed to go there. Well, who wants to go into their trauma? It's not going to be comfortable. And so recognizing that fear is not necessarily negating whatever your intuition is. Fear is something that we have to form a relationship with. And I don't know if fear ever goes away. I think it's just part of being human. All of these things I think are part of being human, that I am thinking about, which is what you guys were saying earlier in our conversation about cutting cords, right? We don't cut cords. We actually form a relationship with them, and you're not going to get rid of your fear. And there isn't a place to extract and put your trauma. Like all of this is about how do we form a healthy relationship and do the best of our ability to walk with what's shown up.
Absolutely. And use all those array of emotions as teachers. Like all of those emotions come. I remember Desmond Tutu said, if you see a child being abused, you should feel angry. Like that's to get you to a place of volition. Like certain things are supposed to come up that, the difference is don't live in that place and let it turn into violence and hatred. That's not very helpful. But there's places for all that stuff as guidance, I think, if we're willing to pay attention to it when it comes up, but not let it get wrapped up into the storylines that take us on these sort of all these different rabbit holes and paths that aren't necessarily beneficial. But yeah, I mean, to me, it's like now, I've gone through so many different processes with this, but I used to think for a long time, it's like, no, I just need to keep trying to stay up here and stay in this place of compassion and lovingness. And it's nothing's inherently wrong with that, but you have to question sometimes, am I actually there? And is that authentic?
Right.
And a lot of times a human experience means you've got to traverse all of it up and down. There's got to be constantly back and forth. But to me, at least, what seems to happen is that I gradually learn, and this is always still a process ongoing all the time, but it's like you catch kind of what the lessons are in the different emotions to reflect back to let you learn more about yourself with each incidence of it. And then that accumulated knowledge and wisdom starts to build. And then I think we maybe act a little more quickly with certain things and take the guidance more sincerely.
I think that's true. I think it becomes the more time that we're able to spend hanging out in compassion, the easier that can be our go-to place. But we definitely have to allow ourselves to experience naturally whatever's arising. And that might be anger, and that might be disappointment, and that, like, all of that spectacular array of emotions are part of what make us alive in enigmatic energy forms. And, and anger in particular, it is the energy that helps us to act. Like, it is that energy that can propel us forward. It has that medicine of fire in it, that, and that solar plex chakra that can move you right into a new place when we allow ourselves to be a channel for it.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
I would love to hear your definition of healing after going through all of these experiences and doing the work from shamanism, and what does healing mean for you, and what's entailed to truly heal?
Yeah, good question. There was a time, probably in the fall of, I think, 2007, where I thought I was healed. And so once upon a time I was healed. And I think maybe it was 2007, 2008, around there. I had gone through an experience where I forgave Peter Bright Eyes, and just because I had compassion in the year of 2006 doesn't mean that I had forgave him yet, that it took a little while for me to really feel that and embody that. So I was pretty sure I had arrived. And maybe that was also part of the experience of being in my 30s. Maybe there's something about, like, I had stuff figured out. And so now my definition of healing is a lot more humble and a lot simpler, that I don't think we ever get there. But I think it's the act of engaging in a loving way with ourselves and life. Beautiful. And just being in that place where we're willing to show up for ourselves and be open to who we are, regardless of wherever we're at, regardless of what's showing up, and know that the imperfection of that is beautiful, that it's not a destination that we're going to arrive at. I can't tell you how many times I've been surprised when something else will come up, either relating to those first few years I lived on my own or my mom's homicide, where I'll think, oh, what the hell? Like, come on, how much more work do I need to do around this? And, and it's just an energy that needs to come through and needs to be felt and needs to be acknowledged in order to be transformed. And the process of that is smoother and simpler as the years go by. But I don't think I'm done, right? I think it's that place where it's just part of being human, where and the more that we allow ourselves to open to that, the greater our capacity to open our hearts to what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. when we were doing some work with Huna Flash, his name's Huna Mautataki, and some of his wisdom's been really enlightening for us too. But we were using the word healing, and he goes, "I don't use healing." He goes, I think of it as expansion. And I really like that because it makes me think when I think of this from even if people wanting to heal from trauma or whether they're wanting to heal from, even like a chronic low back pain, for example, part of when I think of expansion is it's like whatever field we are currently living in or state of consciousness we are living in, certain things are privy to that field or that state of consciousness. And the only way that when things really heal, it's usually because we have stepped into a slightly different field or a slightly different level of consciousness. And then what sort of maybe from an energy frequency basis now no longer resonates, and it starts to drift away or drop away and something else opens up. But it's this ever expanding process, I think, that's part of human evolution. So as we just, like you said, it never really ends. I don't think it can end because I feel like in many ways, I feel like our expansion is probably infinite. And it's just this process of having life experiences. And when we're doing the processes that you're talking about, I feel like inherent within those processes, as you transmute things, as you kind of alchemize the emotions, that was what allows you to then expand and expand and expand. And as you keep expanding something new, you open up new potentials. Every time we expand, we open up new potentials of those infinite potentials. So to me, that really resonated with me. And a lot of the processes that you talk about in the way you describe things resonates in that way with me too.
Yeah, I like the word expansion. That is what's happening, right? Is that we are growing through acknowledging and experiencing wherever it is that we're stuck, whatever that heavy energy is. And when we go into it, we expand. And when we go into it, we expand. And it's that continuous life journey of contraction and expansion and contraction and expansion. And that is what helps us to grow. So anytime that we think we're done, then we're going to be stuck, right? And it might be okay for a little while. However, in order for us to grow more, we have to be willing to set ourselves free from the confines of however we're seeing reality in that present experience to grow. And I think as humans, particularly as we get older, we like the confines of whatever our present experience is, because to grow means we have to change. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's what happens, where so often as we get older, there is that stagnation because there's an unwillingness to accept that there could be another way to see things or experience things that are different or new to us, right? Whereas healing or expansion is allowing ourselves to be maybe more part of that creative life force, in the creative life force.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Anything that you're wondering?
What Huna had mentioned too is that as we are going through this particular time, we're going to have recollections and rememberings in a much more expansive way than we have ever in the past. And so he speaks of the fact that, because we've lived these multiple lives, like this is not just the first life that we're living as a soul being incarnated into this present physical form, we have shown up here millions and trillions of times before. And so with this, as he speaks of it, with this incoming light that's currently flooding the entire cosmos and our planet and our earth and our physical body, we're going to start to perceive and remember, have these recollections from previous lives as well. So when he speaks of expansion, he's speaking of the fact that we're going to come to the realization that, we've not only played the victim, but we've also played the role of the murderer, that we've not only played the female, but we've also played the male role. And so it's not just one piece of reality that we've put the hat on and tried out the outfit on, but we've played so many different roles, many, many, many lifetimes. And it's through this recollection and through this understanding and through this knowing and deep wisdom surfacing that compassion is naturally going to arise. It's no longer going to be this thing that we even have to work towards, but it's just like, okay, I've been there, I've done that, I've done this similar thing. And so, yeah, a lot of what you're speaking to speaks in the same sort of melody.
I just want to say thank God when I hear you say that. Just that as we open to the times that there is this possibility for humanity to collectively remember that we are each other, you know, and that's one of those just crucial pieces in recognizing that there actually isn't anything that's unforgivable. There actually, you know, isn't anybody that you're separate from. And so the more that we acknowledge our need, our desire to be separate because we get our value from being better than. So when we recognize that that is what instigates our desire to be separate, and humble ourselves to consider what is the same as, it starts to change everything. Yeah, I'd love to go into a little bit about collective healing from that.
You know what it made me think of too, Sarah, while you were speaking of that? Like even, you know, the tight clothing and the tight waistline and all these, and the overeating and the stuffing down. I feel like all these sort of habits or appropriation or trends that we've taken on have actually inhibited our connection to intuition, to gut feelings, because there's literally this bottleneck which actually doesn't allow us to tap into the feeling of what it is that we're actually sensing within. There's a disconnect that's happening through that severing or holding.
Yes. And you know what, like food is such a good example for that, and recognizing what we're actually hungry for. We actually want to put in our bodies, what actually feels good in our bodies, and being able to be with that long enough to experience and sense it. And if you think, again, I know this happens for men too, but it can be so common for women, all of the different diet patterns that women can get caught up in, all of the different things that you should eat, all of the different right ways to do it so that you'll look like this or be like this. And nobody's actually sensing or listening to what their body's telling them. And so no wonder people don't know how to listen to their intuition. I remember being out with a friend of mine who is on a very conscious spiritual path as well, but has a harder time listening to her belly. And we were at a vegan restaurant and she wanted to have the ginger beef that's, you know, the vegan. And I said something about just knowing that if I did, you know, that it just didn't feel right in my body. And she's like, well, how do you know that right away? I'm like, it just chew it. It'll, your body's going to tell you, right? Like your stomach will. And so we're so disconnected from the actual experience of chewing and tasting and allowing our saliva to inform our belly, which then informs our body, which then goes through that whole digesting process. And we can relate that whole digesting process to how we experience toxins or poisons such as trauma in our day-to-day life. We might not have had a choice over them coming into our felt sense. However, we do have a choice over how we digest them. But that severance from our bellies and that severance from our bodies is what keeps us from recognizing that we have any power to do anything.
You know, what's really neat too, it makes me think of, we did this course with a month-long online course with Denise Lynn. And she actually, one of the meditation practices that she had us go through was walking us through the groceries to a store, and being within our body, sensing within our body whatever it is that we were feeling as we approached, you know, the dairy section, the fruit section, and how does it feel to go towards and grab the bottle of milk? How does your body feel? And that was such a neat experience. Like even when you're describing, you know, actually tasting and allowing your body to give you the feedback. Well, this was a meditation. So we were energetically going through this grocery store and reaching for the milk bottle and sensing what it was within our body. And like for me, that particular moment, I was like feeling really heavy in the pit of my stomach. And it also makes me think of that plant exercise. Do you remember where so there was a study done with a plant where they had sensors on the
Right.
plant itself, and this person had the intention of going into a room in order to cause harm to this plant. And as soon as that person entered the room where that plant was, the sensors and the machines that were hooked up on this plant started to display really erratic patterns. The plant already knew, without the person physically going there onto the plant and causing any sort of wreckage, then the plant had sensed that intention as soon as the person came close. So it makes me think, like, even on an energetic level, in ways that we can't even completely perceive or be aware of at this time, there is that knowing, there is that bodily intelligence.
Mhm. Well, and
Yeah.
I mean, if I incorporate, say, applied kinesiology testing and stuff, you'll see it all the time in people. The body will tell you very differently than sometimes what you even think.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes really surprising for people, but it's also, I think, very empowering when people also recognize what the body's showing them, right?
And the impact just energetically, like you're saying. I had one of my twin girls did the science fair experiment where she had 3 geraniums, and one she talked to lovingly each day.
Mm.
One was the neutral, and one she could swear at, she could be mean to, whatever she wanted to do. And she couldn't believe how that impacted its growth. Right. Of
Yeah.
course, after I felt like I had to give it extra love, I'm like, sorry, little guy, thanks. But it taught her a lot also about the impact of her words, the impact of her body language, the impact of how we express ourselves on plants. Therefore, it has an impact on everybody.
Yeah, no, super powerful. So to get back to the last question, I'll pose, this was actually a question that you posed in your book. So I'll read the question you posed in the book, and then we'll follow through with that one. So you had mentioned, what if our suffering and how we address it holds the keys to our personal and collective awakening? So can you explain how our individual journey with suffering may play a role in the collective awakening of humanity?
Yes, I can. In the humblest way possible, simply through the lens of my own experience. What I can speak to with that is that I came to understand that through going through the process of moving into my mother's homicide and finding any of those traces of violence inside of my own body, of violence against women, of rape, of the degradation of the sacred feminine, as I worked on or tuned into or released that energy, I could also see a connection with my own work and showing up as an advocate for the sacred feminine, as an advocate for the earth, as an advocate for tending to and caring for that on a collective level. Also, in the very fact that the person who killed my mother was First Nations, and he himself, his family went to residential schools in Alberta at a place called Blue Quill near Saddle Lake. And he was carrying the scars of compound trauma, of generational trauma, of colonialism. And so the more that I dug into my curiosity about who he was, so the more that I was willing to step out of the personal, right? And initially when we go through grief or trauma, it's very selfish. It's all about us, right? Because we're hurt and we're in pain, and and that does need to be tended to. However, if we want to, as we do our work around that, we can get curious about how it could also relate to the greater context. So I started to want to know who he was. So this was now moving me into more of a collective level. A lot of this came through guidance when I'd be in deep meditation or in some of the ceremonies that I participated in, where I would feel compelled to understand him And so I took steps that led me in that direction. And those steps were, I knew he had a sister because she had been in a CBC documentary called Beating the Streets, produced by Lorna Thomas, that came out in 1996. And I remembered that her name was Marilyn, and I looked her up on Facebook, right, on social media. This was, I think, in 2010. And so we had some conversations on social media. And at first, I was really nervous. I didn't know what I wanted from her, but I know that I wanted something. Yeah. But I couldn't name it, and I didn't know if I'd be rejected. And so I felt very vulnerable in approaching her, but she was very open and forthcoming and willing to share whatever she could about her family or about her brother that would be helpful for me. However, she was 13 years younger. And at the time that I contacted her, she also lived in BC and I was living in Alberta. And so I wanted to know more about where he had come from, because I had this sense that the impact of colonization, so again, this is speaking to the collective, somehow was connected to my mom's homicide. And I thought that I knew a lot about the impact of colonization because, because I had a friend who was Dene, because, the way that a lot of, white people think that they know. I lived in a community that was half First Nations, and the schools that my kids went to were about half First Nations. So there was a lot of ceremony and practices, powwow, that were at the school. And so I had exposure to culture in that way. However, I was in for a big eye opener when I went to Saddle Lake First Nation and was assigned to work with a former chief, Eric Large. And I speak about this in my book as well, where he really initiated a big teaching into how present the impacts of residential schools and 60 scoop and other compounded trauma were, because they didn't actually happen as long ago as I had thought that they had. And even if they had, there was never any resolution or acknowledgement or responsibility from those who had been the oppressors, which is a really important part of healing, right? And so inasmuch my journey became a big one of wanting to understand what was the bigger picture and how could my understanding of this bigger picture in relation to the impact of colonization on First Nations in Treaty 6 areas where I lived. So in that area, but then as a whole in Canada, how could my understanding of that be of service, right? How could I do something to ensure that other people didn't lose their mother in the same way, right? How could I let my experience be a vehicle to open up to a greater capacity for healing? I guess those all would have been some of the energy behind what was motivating me. And I didn't have the answers, and I don't even know if I do now. Rather than the more that we can understand about who we have otherized, the more we can come into a greater place of collective understanding. And that opens our hearts to shared humanity. And so that's, some of the pieces that became a part of that. There was some unusual synchronicities, and I was invited to come and speak and share my story shortly after I first met this former chief that I had started working with, for lack of a better term. Basically, he was more of teaching or sharing with me about the history of his people. And then he invited me to come and do some trauma healing talks, and which I did over the course of a couple of years. And after a couple of years, I did end up meeting Marilyn Bright Eyes for the first time, the younger sister of Peter. And we had been speaking through the years. And she's just a year or two older than me. And we really ended up having an affinity for each other. And so if you can imagine this, like we met for the first time at the Blue Quill Culture Camp, which was the former residential school, which I had toured. I think it was the day before I met her. And so I'm holding the feelings of how repressive and unjust and inhumane the whole experience of residential schools would have been, knowing that her mom went there and some of her older siblings went there, and that likely that instigated my mom's death. I mean, her brother likely had FASD as well, and people with FASD typically don't understand the long-term consequence of their actions. And so like all of these little pieces ended up bringing me into a place of collective understanding and collective healing. And Marilyn and I in time started sharing our own stories together. And so that's how what opened doors, for in my prayer to be of service. And one of the difficult points that I remember on that journey is going over to Marilyn's house when she was living on the reserve there. And she'd invited me over for tea. I think I drove her home after one of the times that we first met. And she was just sharing more about her family. And then she offered to go through family photo albums. And I thought, sure, okay. And then all of a sudden she flips open the page and there's her brother right there on a page. And I was accustomed to seeing him in the one image that was shown in the media through the years, or in the few times that I went to the trial. So here he is in different scenarios. And I felt my gut tense up and everything inside of me freeze for a moment where I didn't feel like I could breathe. And then I intentionally softened my breath and remembered that I was there for a reason. I needed to learn about this. I needed to understand. I needed to move past my idea that we were separate from each other, and that somehow this was a mission I even felt like my mother had tasked me with, and my own helping spirits, and maybe even that of Bright Eyes's bloodline as well, that somehow through this experience, we were bringing healing to both ancestral lines. And this is what collective healing can be.
Yeah. Wow. It reminds me a bit of being at one of Dr. Peter Levine's workshops, and he was actually showing a video of where he had worked with some First Nations people around collective trauma, and almost the epigenetics of how trauma gets passed down through generations, and that in healing the grandkids of the people that had suffered some severe trauma that was passed down, how the conversation evolved was that clearing that trauma with at that point in time actually, and how they discussed it after, was that it felt like that cleared the trauma for the ancestors that had gone through that trauma as well.
7 generations past.
Yeah.
I believe that that's how it works.
Mm-hmm.
And more so when Marilyn and I will do a talk together. I mean, the talks we do together are so important, and they're so raw, that neither of us know what's going to happen, other than we're both going to share our stories of healing trauma, and then we're going to be open to conversations or questions that come through the group. And we're actually intending on doing one on Zoom that will be likely in the next couple of months, and that information will be on my website. But it creates an actual felt experience for those who are listening to understand how we can be with very difficult experiences of trauma and learn how to find shared humanity. And I think we have to. I think that, we are at such a huge turning point for ourselves and for our species right now. And we have to get over ourselves. We have to be willing to recognize what connects us, and to let go of all of this, old attachment to identifying who we are by what we do and where we're tiered on the hierarchy of life, and justifying how we act or how we live based on that.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like in many ways you've got both of those sides coming up. It's like I feel like there's been more awareness around what we're talking about more than ever. And at the same point, I feel like the other sort of piece of things around creating even more segmentalism is even stronger than it ever has. And it eventually is going to hit I feel like that's kind of what happens when we're at the brink of major transformation anyways. Everything has to come up to a point where it is in the, it's coming closer and closer and closer. You can't avoid anymore. You can see it so clearly that then that's when things are going to have an opportunity to transform.
Mm-hmm. I wonder sometimes, Jason, if it just hasn't always been this way. I have these moments of wondering, through the history of humanity, maybe there's always been divisiveness and chaos, and not from a place that's, apathetic, but maybe some of this madness is just simply what we came here to learn about.
Yeah.
And we can choose to step out of the confines of consensual reality and into a place where we're more of witnessing. So we have our part that participates, but we also have that sacred witness. And that gives us the power to go into a deeper place of transformation. But maybe the chaos is part of it.
I absolutely think the chaos is part of it. I ultimately think, even if you go back and look at some of the biggest times of transition within your own life, most of the time it evolved out of what appeared to be chaos initially anyways. At least a lot of times when I think of my biggest times that I feel like I've had my biggest learnings or transformations in my own life, usually it wasn't a super smooth ride prior to that. It's almost like, I think stuff bubbles up to a point that something's going to happen with it.
It makes me think of what your mom said with, like, there's no accidents. There are no accidents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And what I love about that awareness or that analogy is that when we hang out in the space of there are no accidents, then it's so much easier for us to be in love with who we are and where we're at, because we see that it's all perfect.
Yeah, you strip away a lot of the judgment that we inherently start to put on things that seem to be going according to plan.
Totally. And the way our minds will be in that place of, I only need to get this done first, and then I will be happy or content with this. I need to take care of this. And then, like how our mind is continuously in that place of projecting into an unknown future outcome. Whereas if we recognize that there's no accidents, or and bring ourselves home to the present moment, then it's like, oh, well, this is perfect, actually, inclusive of all of the, the chaos and the imperfections and the wherever it is that you find yourself have landed.
Yeah. Sarah, so enjoyed talking to you. And I feel like we could carry on in for hours more, but we will have you back for a live event, and we will coordinate things with, usually in the series, we will bring other guests together and do a bit of a roundtable discussion. So we'll have that information out for people once we have the dates for that. But we will be bringing you back to talk more about these. And when we do those ones, so what you can do is, when you do watch this episode, post questions that you would like us to ask Sarah. And then when we do the live, those people, any questions you put, those questions we put up first. And then when we do the live, you can also post questions live during the event as well. But it gives us an idea to start to get some questions down that we can then ask you specifically about. So for the people viewing, please, on the YouTube channel, you can write down your questions under this episode. Sarah, for people that want to learn more about the work you're doing, about the books, about the courses, the Zoom events, where's the best places for people to go? Where can we send them?
You can send them to my website, which is my full name, sarahsalterkelly.com. And my book is available for pre-order right now. I'm anticipating that I will have it June 21st. And there are courses on the events page and lots of other information on my website.
Wonderful, Sarah, an absolute pleasure. And check out the book. It really is a beautiful book. It's got so many pearls of wisdom. And again, it's like, I
have a box of tissue nearby.
Yeah. There's so much healing that takes place in the process of telling stories from that raw, authentic place. So just by reading it, you will feel yourself starting to shift inside. So,
well,
Sarah,
even when I say, like, have a box of tissue nearby, through that emotional release, I feel like there's going to be your own personal shifts taking place, and I feel like your book creates an allowance for that to happen.
Thank you so much, Taya, and thank you so much, Jason, for having me on your show this morning. I've really enjoyed your questions, and I'm really excited that this was the first platform of me sharing for my upcoming book release. And I just feel so excited to see where it's going to go and how it can be of service.
Wonderful. Sarah, thank you so much.
Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to invest in your health and well-being. Since this podcast is brand new, reviews and subscribers are so vital for us to get off the ground and share this really important information. So if you found this information valuable, please post a review and subscribe to the podcast so you'll get our newest episodes. Also, if you know of someone who would benefit from this, please share it with them. You can also find us on Instagram at #InspireHealthPodcast. If you have a question that you'd like to be addressed, direct message me on Instagram or leave a comment on one of my posts. I would love to hear from you. And you can grab our show notes and free resources for each episode at inspirehealthpodcast.com. So be sure to go online and check it out.